All right, good morning, everyone. This is Chair Bonner. We are going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to call, it does appear that we have quorum, so I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order of the Legislative Commission on Cybersecurity. A quorum is currently present. We would normally do approval of the minutes at this stage of the game. However, we did find a few corrections to those notes just before coming live here. So we're going to make those corrections and move the approval of the meeting minutes from November 23rd to the next meeting. And we can approve those together. That said, we will jump right in. We have first up an update on the NCSL Task Force on AI, Cybersecurity, and Data Privacy. And we have Representative Elkins here, and we're going to let him take that away. Yeah.
Oh, the NCSL Task Force, yes. So we are still meeting regularly. And had a discussion at the most recent, just like yesterday, wasn't it? We had panel discussion with the attorney generals of several states that have implemented state privacy laws about how they're going about enforcing the laws, especially in Oregon and Colorado and Connecticut, which have already actually implemented their laws, and mostly looking for tips to legislators about how to improve those laws and what some of the challenges are in terms of, for example, all of the AG offices, including ours, are having trouble hiring tech experts who can help them with the forensic analysis. So very worthwhile. And then the next session next week is going to be related to state AI. And Brandon, I need to figure out who is the best speaker for Minnesota at that one. I sent them some information about Taiga, and they said, yes, that's exactly what we want to talk about.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you for that update. And I want to say, too, it's important to keep in mind that one of the ways in which all of these things sort of tie together, as we know, there's a lot of conversation at NCSL around AI and specifically generative AI. But as we know, all of that is fed by data. So there's a lot of conversation in the forum right now about data and how we secure that, how it's collected, how it's stored, how it's being handled. And then, of course, cybersecurity, which is the topic of this particular committee. We know the number one priority for folks who are looking to violate cybersecurity is often to gather data, right? And that impacts profoundly government agencies and ordinary citizens as well. So it all sort of goes hand in hand. So I appreciate that update and certainly know that that has a real bearing on the work we do here. With that, we are going to move then next to a minute update. We have here Assistant Commissioner and Chief Information Security Officer, John Israel. I will allow you to come and again introduce yourself and then give us sort of an update on what we know has been a little bit of a short time to prepare. As you know, the CrowdStrike issue cropped up just last week, so we know this is still very fresh. And appreciate that you are willing to come and give us sort of an update on how that has impacted state agencies thus far, and of course, give us some ideas on how we're doing with respect to that issue. And with that, Commissioner Israel, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Chair Bonner. My name is, for the record, is John Israel. I am an Assistant Commissioner for MN.IT Services and the Chief Information Security Officer for the state, here representing MN.IT and the state agencies and the response. I appreciate the time this morning to come and provide an update. As you are all likely aware, and pretty much I think with the news coverage and everything that's happened over the last week, there's probably very few that haven't kind of tracked what happened in the wee hours of last Thursday night, early Friday morning, when a global IT IT outage created by a security vendor named CrowdStrike, and an update that they pushed out to devices kind of in those early morning hours that impacted significantly a significant number of Windows devices for their customers. And ultimately what happened in that kind of global IT outage, we've actually had a number of conversations with CrowdStrike. I actually got a chance to meet with the leaders of the company a couple days ago, the president and CEO and members of their organization, to get updates a little bit on kind of what their take on what happened and how this event occurred, and what they're doing to kind of resolve and prevent that from the future. But ultimately in Minnesota, that in the early mornings of Friday, late Thursday night, early Friday morning, we Minute staff and our local government staff started identifying devices that were crashing, essentially getting to a Windows blue screen of death, as we refer to it. That scary screen that says that your computer is crashed and it's not going to be operational. The early stages of that, we certainly did not know what was going on. There was a lot of kind of really kind of quick response to identify what that impact was. But as we got a handle on that within the first hour and understood that it was actually a software operational outage and not a cyber attack, was the kind of our first focus. Once we confirmed that it was an operational outage, really focused the work on what is impacted and how do we resolve that. I will say that from the early hours of when we first detected this, we started pulling numbers on impacted devices. There were over 24,000 laptops and desktops within the state that were impacted, that had been crashed with this. About 5,000, there were, actually I've got some numbers for you, about 33,000, over 3,000 servers. We had domain controllers, which do that authentication, kind of a key component of kind of getting devices up and running. So a total of about 27,000 devices that were impacted in those early hours. I'm happy to report that as of this morning, the overall impact is down to under 500 devices. The vast majority of those are laptops that either in remote offices that aren't being used, folks that are traveling, things like that. So we're happy to report that the significant work that Minute teams and our partners have done over the last week really significantly restored that effort. Just talking about what happened on that first day. On Friday morning, when we started this response with 27,000 devices that were impacted, by the end of that day, we were down to about 7,000. Just under 7,000. So significant number of that resource, including all of the priority applications for our agencies and the infrastructure were restored on that first day. Obviously, as you can expect, with a very complex environment and lots of infrastructure around, there were a lot of teams that came together. And I would say that the work and the effort from our Minute teams, I would want to applaud them as being kind of heroic from that aspect of being able to quickly coalesce and respond to identify what the priority response should be and to get the kind of the critical infrastructure back up and running. We really focused the first early hours on restoring the infrastructure, the things that everybody relies on to get things operational, making sure that our network infrastructure, our domain controllers, so that we can do the authentication, we could do the connection and lookups, get everybody connected first, and then started focusing based on the priority of the applications. Thankfully, over the last several years, due to some increased investment in disaster recovery planning, continuity planning, a directive from Commissioner Tomes to the cabinet, to our Minute teams and others to prioritize all state systems, to identify what are the most critical systems, really helped prepare the state for that response by allowing teams to focus on the most critical applications that had the greatest impact on Minnesotans throughout the response and get those recovered first. The ongoing effort, so I would say, is primarily really focused on kind of looking at how do we continuing to work with all of our partners to ensure that statewide, knowing that there's many local governments as well that are using this software, using similar tools, ensuring that they've had the resources to recover, continuing to share information from that perspective. I have some information on some of the critical apps if that's of interest, but I'm glad to kind of pause here and see if you've got questions or things that you'd like to dive into.
Before we go to the next stage, does anybody have any questions on things that have already been discussed?
Oh, sorry. Before we move to the next stage, does anyone have any questions on the items that have already been discussed? I will actually ask you to continue, Commissioner. I think the one thing that I would just say, though, here is, I think it is a pretty remarkable how much, to go from 27,000 devices down to 7,000 in under 24 hours. And I've been reading a little bit about the remedies for how to overcome the CrowdStrike challenges. And from my understanding, and you can speak to this more, of course, is that it is not exactly the easiest thing to recover from, that it's actually quite challenging. It might involve multiple resets, and a number of other factors, which makes it really complicated. So to move from 27,000 devices down to 7 in a day, that is really remarkable. And I just want to make sure that the crowd, or the general public who might be listening to this recording understands. And I had looked up, nationwide, we're talking about 8.5 million devices impacted. 5,000 flights canceled. We're still hearing in the news locally about some challenges over at Delta, and flights still trying to get back online. It impacted healthcare, banks, and financial institutions, which is pretty extreme to have that all happen at one time. And so I just want to say thank you for all of the hard work of the folks at Minute who managed to make that possible, because I know that that takes a pretty wide and incredible team in order to accomplish that in such a short amount of time. So with that, it looks like we do have one question from Representative Lucero. Okay. Representative Lucero, did you want to go ahead with your question? Senator, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so my question, or it's more of a comment and splash question, but not necessarily needing an answer. One of the things that I think the CrowdStrike incident worldwide demonstrated is that there are those of us, obviously in the industry, that we take for granted that vendors, software vendors, and any vendors have a robust QA process before pushing out updates. There are many of our systems that we allow to be automatically updated, again, taking that for granted. As this incident demonstrated, I don't think we can necessarily take that for granted. This created an incredible work effort. It created, obviously, it was the equivalent of a denial of service, taking down so many systems, violating the A in the CIA triad availability, and it had potentially, if the CrowdStrike software on the systems had to be taken down, or the alerts that would have been generated from it, it can obviously also have an impact on confidentiality for that period of time while mitigation or remediation was happening. So I'm just throwing that out there as a thought that we can't necessarily take this for granted. It obviously created an incredible, unexpected workload. So my question for a minute would be, and again, it doesn't necessarily need an answer because I don't want to necessarily put anything on the public record that might be sensitive, but have there been efforts, and perhaps the post-mortem hasn't happened yet, but will there be conversations post-mortem in the analysis that look at some of the processes that might prevent, the best we can, of such a similar incident in the future with any of the vendors? That, again, we allow direct access to our systems at such an elevated privilege that create this denial of service.
Right. Thank you. Assistant Commissioner Israel.
Madam Chair and members, I fully agree with your comments, and I will also acknowledge that I'm not quite at liberty to discuss kind of all of the details of the work that we're doing with our vendors, but as part of this effort and in response, just in general, security tools have a deep grasp on operating systems, and by necessity. The only way that we're able to protect these systems is these tools that are deeply embedded and have a potential of impact. And so part of what the evaluation and the response that we've been working through with not only this vendor but others is evaluating kind of what their processes are for QA and testing. We've gotten significant updates on and kind of on work that is being done with this particular vendor, but we're taking those lessons learned to evaluate with others. I would also acknowledge that MN.IT is constantly evaluating kind of our entire security stack and tools, and we'll continue to do so over the course of the next years, kind of looking at and ensuring that all of our products, that we have a recovery path, we have a resiliency path to mitigate the potential of a particular tool like this impacting such a significant amount of the environment.
Thank you. Senator Lucero, did you have any follow-up?
That's all I have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. And I certainly appreciate that we are in sort of that postmortem phase where folks are looking through to see what happened. I know there are a lot of questions in a lot of minds, including those in this room, on what could possibly have happened in that Q&A process, that this was missed. It feels like a big one. So I think we're all kind of waiting a little bit with bated breath to find out what transpired in that situation, as I'm sure you are as well. With that, we also have a question from Representative Elkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I realized that the question I have would be best asked offline.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Representative Elkins. With that, we will turn it back then to Commissioner Israel to continue with his remarks.
No, thank you for that. I was going to just kind of mention that that throughout the course of the recovery and the response, our focus was kind of identifying and working with our business partners to understand what those impacts were. And as I mentioned, we really focused on recovering kind of those core key systems. So looking at the things like our public safety systems, getting the public safety answering points, getting life safety systems back up and running, working towards MNsure and METS, understanding that impact, MnDrive, kind of our key states of systems and services. Some of the work that MN.IT did to kind of respond split into multiple work streams so that we can ensure that the recovery of the applications was working in parallel with recovery of our workstations. In order to support a statewide workforce, we did end up standing up support centers throughout the state, in every corner of the state, in order to provide access over the weekend, the last weekend, as well as all week this week, to provide easy access for employees, because as you called out, this was a very significant outage. It's not a simple one where we can just push an update and recover from it. In many cases, it required physical interaction and access to those devices. That was impactful. That shifted the work focus for a number of our MN.IT employees as we worked to do that recovery. But throughout the entire effort, I will say our business partners, employees understood. They recognized that this was a global outage that was not specifically tied to MN.IT's resources or services, and really appreciated the support and the ease of that response process. I will say kind of just some numbers. Our service desk that handles the calls from employees was typically receives about 500 or 600 calls a day. And in the early days of this, we were receiving 3,000, 4,000 calls the first couple of days of this outage, trying to help guide employees back on the response. As of, that was Friday, it was about 3,000, 3,600 reports. By Saturday, we're down to 100, coming back on Monday, knowing that people were off for the weekend. About 1,600 on Monday, about 1,000 on Tuesday, and it's dropped significantly now as with no waits in any of the queues to help any of the employees, and we're able to actually get back to normal operations and repairing the things that just go bump in the night for other reasons.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that, Assistant Commissioner. That is really valuable insight, and that is a lot of calls. Just out of curiosity on that point, that is a pretty intense volume of calls. Did we have to call folks, extra staff in, or did we have to do some additional measures in order to make that possible?
We did have to tap into, Madam Chair, we did have to tap into additional resources and teams to ensure that we could handle all of the volume. Some of the early calls and challenges on Friday was the phone systems were also impacted in the early hours. So we weren't able to actually take calls for the first part early Friday morning until that system was restored. But for the most part, we really focused on trying to get our teams that were not on approved time off deployed throughout the state, get the resources out to the state agencies and to the facilities and the employees that needed them throughout the weekend and the early hours of the week.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And, I think it calls into serious clarity. About 10 years ago, I worked for a firm here in the Twin Cities, I won't give their name, but I actually worked on the disaster recovery team. And I remember at the time, the conversation was more about, well, what if we have a flood? What if we have a tornado? What if, how do we back up our data centers? Things like that. But when we talk to the business folks, disaster recovery and continuity planning was obviously something we thought about, and it's something we did, but I think it was always viewed as sort of this worst-case scenario, right? There's a 1% chance this is going to happen, but, we'll put together a loose plan on this. Maybe we'll have to use it someday, but there really wasn't this sense of urgency behind the work. And I think that this has clearly pointed out that sometimes that worst-case scenario actually does come forward. I think we're fortunate in that this particular issue wasn't necessarily compromising any personal data or systems from the statewide perspective, but it certainly puts in sharp definition the need for disaster recovery and continuity planning and the importance of having those priorities in terms of how we bring systems up and in which order to make sure that we can continue to do the work that we do every day for our citizens and for the state. And I think that's a really important point to throw out there. So I want to thank you again for all of that hard work. And I know Commissioner Tomes has been very diligent on these points as well, as have you. And it is a real testament for Minnesota that we're continually doing that. With that, are there any other questions for the Assistant Commissioner? If not, I always like to ask about lessons learned. I'm an Agilist. So I'll give you a chance if you have any immediate thoughts. But I certainly understand that part of that lessons learned process will be evolving over the next weeks, months, and so forth after this incident. It's a little early yet for the lessons learned, but is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head that went really well, or things that maybe we could improve upon for next time?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thanks for that opportunity. I would agree. The continuity planning and those efforts significantly supported the ability to recover and continue operations where it was critical throughout the state. And I have to applaud the state agencies for the work that they've done and thank this commission and both the chambers for the investments in cybersecurity over the last few years that have helped position MN.IT in a way to better respond, as well as the kind of the benefits of IT consolidation. So by the IT consolidation really helped support the ability for us to come together and respond in such a coordinated manner that may not have been as readily possible prior to that. I would say the lessons learned, as you mentioned, are still to come. Some of those may be, as Senator Lucero kind of called out, like the opportunities to kind of continue to evolve and evaluate the processes used by vendors that have such deep insight and control of our systems to ensure that those processes are resilient and we can continue to drive availability and recoverability of all of our environments to prevent and hopefully prevent anything like this from happening again, but position ourselves to recover even faster if there is a challenge in the future.
All right. Yes, Representative Elkins.
So, Mr. Israelson, so the agencies that aren't under MN.IT purview, like the University of Minnesota, MNSCU, the constitutional offices, do you find yourself supporting them as well, even though they're not technically under your purview?
Assistant Commissioner.
Yeah, Chair Bonner, and members. Yes, to an extent. So we've built a coalition of information sharing, and I think I see this as part of kind of our mission to coordinate and be a cybersecurity leader within the state. So through our relationship with Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the Minnesota Fusion Center, our cybersecurity coordination, the cybersecurity navigator team that we've built over the last few years, using through kind of the state and local cyber grant program resources and the legislative appropriation that supported that, allowed us to build a coalition of information sharing. So that team was constantly throughout this event collecting information, best practices, sharing updates to our state and local partners throughout the state that are not under minute consolidation.
Yes, thank you. Senator Wickland.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of brings to mind something I was wondering about. Also, do you think that we have processes in place for, we've talked about more about cybersecurity information sharing. Do you think that the current processes that we have in place are set up to allow for things when they aren't a cyber incident, but they are certainly a system impacting incident? Are those processes for information sharing going to work even though they aren't necessarily a cybersecurity incident? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Assistant Commissioner.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Senator Wickland, yes, I would agree that those processes are the exact processes that we utilized throughout this outage. So the network of local governments, the network of other partners that we've built over the last few years for that threat information sharing, we exercised those connections to share information on this outage. And I would foresee doing so on any major impactful event. We would not save that just for cyber events. We treated this like a cyber event because it had such as Senator Lucero called it, a denial of service impact on those devices that were impacted. So we utilized all the channels that we had in order to kind of share the information to coordinate resources and response. We did have partners on the early calls just in case this was a cyber event. So we've got a close working relationship with the Minnesota National Guard through Homeland Security Emergency Management and Public Safety. We kept in coordination with them just to share information through emergency managers as well at the local level, trying to ensure that we can minimize impact statewide. I would foresee doing that on any large scale event like this.
And it bears repeating that, of course, Minnesota is one of a handful of states that has been working on things like cyber incident reporting among some of those smaller agencies, and I think that has been an ongoing thread for a lot of legislators, how we not only really solidify our security posture for state agencies, but all of our partners as well, those folks in counties and cities and school systems. So I think it's really important to call that out as well. It looks like we do have an additional question from Representative Nash.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members. Just wanted to make a quick comment. Senator Lucero articulated many of the things that came to my mind as well, and would look forward to speaking with Assistant Commissioner Israel offline. But just wanted to say that from a speed of response perspective, on the morning that this all went down, I actually got an alert to my phone, and I sent a text to Commissioner Tomes and to Brandon. And while I was on a lake fishing, I got a phone call to follow up and let me know that they were aware of it, that they were working on it. So just wanted to make sure that we gave kudos to the team for being responsive, not just to the devices that were impacted and the leaders of those agencies, but also to the legislative members of this task force, because obviously it came to mind for all of us probably quite quickly. So just wanted to say thanks.
Right. Thank you, Representative Nash. We do have one additional question on the Zoom from Senator Zhang.
Hello. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question for the commissioner, maybe like in hindsight, what systems in place did you feel that had helped us as we're trying to navigate this, have been helpful in, identifying the issue and, trying to make sense of what was happening in the past week here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Assistant Commissioner.
Yeah, Madam Chair, my response is going to be a little bit guarded because I want to preserve a little bit of our flexibility on kind of the security tooling and kind of the technology that we're using to respond. I would call out kind of kudos to our teams that were on that early response call, because the first signs of impact, this impact started sometime between 11 and midnight on Thursday night a week ago. By probably right around midnight, we had full teams on and engaged, and probably within the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, we'd identified that this was the actual cause of this event being a CrowdStrike outage update. I think that there's plenty of opportunities as we reevaluate and do the after action. We'll identify other parts of our infrastructure, other mechanisms to build on that resiliency to ensure that an event like this does not have such a large-scale impact. I'm not quite comfortable talking too significantly on that, but I think we'd be glad to kind of continue to talk with the members here and kind of engage as we identify those solutions, propose opportunities, and build those into our processes.
All right. Thank you for that, Assistant Commissioner. And I think we will certainly, as those lessons learned roll out and we think about tools that you found really helpful in diagnosing this early and being able to communicate effectively, if we need to talk about additional investments in those tools, certainly that's something that probably I'm sure will end up on the desk of the legislature and how we fund that. But I think we'll be keeping a close eye on that. And I do want to say that, I heard of a number of states, cities, or areas who were really still struggling with CrowdStrike days later. But to say that we went from 27,000 devices to 7,000 in less than a day, that we were able to identify it really quickly in working with our partners, disseminating information, including some of our smaller agencies, treating this as if it were a cybersecurity incident to make sure that we're sharing that information across platforms and across our partners in government is really remarkable, right? And when we talk about government, it is not typical for us to say that we move quickly, right? But in this case, we moved at lightning speed. And I think that is a real testament to the work that you've done. And I really want to be thoughtful about saying thank you for that. Representative Nash called it out as well, that response is really in those critical minutes. It is something that it is priceless. And so I want to thank you for that. With that, I do not have any more questions on the board at the moment. So what we may do is say thank you to Assistant Commissioner Israel for his time today, for sharing those updates with us. We certainly appreciate, within a matter of days, being able to come forward and present something to us. I know it's a lot of pressure when you're still kind of under the throes of making sure everything is as it should be. So I appreciate that time and consideration. And with that, we will move on to our next guest. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner. All right, and we will call up then the update. We're going to move on to an update for the Minnesota Data Practices Act. And we're going to maybe start with a brief introduction. Representative Elkins, did you want to do a brief introduction on sort of the nuance behind this particular topic and what brought it sort of to the forefront for you? And then, of course, we can go into inviting our guest up here.
Yep. Well, we passed the Consumer Data Privacy Act that governs the privacy of data in private hands, but we have long had a Data Practices Act which governs the use of government in government hands. And after we had a presentation before this commission a while back from the University of Minnesota about their data breach, in response to which Mr. Don Gemberling, who was one of the co-founders of the Minnesota Council on Government Information, kind of the godfather of the Data Practices Act, wrote an op-ed in the Star Tribune addressing how we didn't necessarily need to make any changes to the laws to prevent this because the law already presented this. So I thought it would be good to have him here and present his perspective in person. Something that's also been on my mind is that as I was going through this journey, 5-year journey of getting a consumer data privacy bill passed, we did a lot of research, worked with legislators in other states to kind of fine-tune the legislation. And I've also been wondering if there are things that we learned from that process that we ought to go back and try to apply to the Data Practices Act as well. So I'll just throw out one example, and then we'll get to allow Mr. Gemmerling to speak. But in the state level data privacy acts, any locational data about a person that identifies a person's location to within about 1/3 of a mile, or as I put it, 4 decimal degrees of latitude and longitude, that data is considered sensitive and it can't be sold or shared without the consumer's approval. In the Data Practices Act, I've been pulled in a couple of times to additions to the Data Practices Act regarding different kinds of locational data. The most recent one that comes to mind is the Met Council collecting locational data from bus fare cards. Okay. And the Data Practices Act has grown to over 135 pages at this point. I don't know how long it is. It's about last time I looked, it was over 135 pages, and most of it is specific exemptions to the general principles. And it occurred to me that maybe it would be a good idea to, instead of addressing these kinds of issues at the level of trip information collected from bus fare cards, just say in general that in the Data Practices Act, any data in government hands that identifies a person's location to within 1/3 of a mile / 4 decimal degrees of latitude and longitude is considered private, non-public data. So we didn't have to keep changing the law every time that we had that kind of an aha moment. So with that, I will open it up to Mr. Gemberling.
Yes, thank you, Representative Elkins, for that introduction. And just to be clear, our next guest, we're inviting up Don Gemberling from what's often called MNCOGI, or the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information. And so we are going to allow you, sir, to come up as our subject matter expert, my apologies, to give us a little bit more insight into the Data Practices Act and your insights.
Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Chair, members. You put me in a terrible nostalgic mood. I was hired by the state of Minnesota in 1968 as an analyst in the original Central Computer Services Organization. At that time, there were 2 computers, okay? We're now up to 29,000, okay? Eventually, there were 3 computers, which is the one I ended up working with. But like I say, you sent me to a strange place with Commissioner Israel's testimony. And by way of introduction, I floated in and out of the minute equivalent in the Department of Administration 3 or 4 different times, in part because of how specialized what I did. I had a very small organization, so whenever they were trying to balance out the org charts, give one more assistant commissioner one more piece so it'll look balanced, they'd send me over there, okay? And actually, at one time, I was in charge of computer security for the state of Minnesota, which, given my qualifications, was a little bit dicey, but I had really good people who worked for me. So that's me. I've worked with the Data Practices Act since before it was the Data Practices Act. I don't really consider myself the father of the Data Practices Act because, oddly enough, there was a computer professional who was the real father of the Data Practices Act, okay? He was the person who managed the first state centralized computer facility. He came from the private sector. He also had a interest in civil liberties. He was a member of the Civil Liberties Union. And he brought that issue to the fore here and worked on it for years, okay? At some point, I ended up working for him, and he's up here and I'm doing the detail. And so when you do the detail, you somehow become more of a subject matter expert. Now, the Coalition on Government Information, our primary focus, we're an all-volunteer organization. We've been around since 1989, strangely enough. We figured out we've really been here a long time. We tend to focus heavily on issues of making sure that a maximum amount of government information is transparent. That's the new word. We used to call it access to government information, and there's a real difference between those concepts. And I have to say, every once in a while, when you said things like, we don't want to talk about this publicly, and I kind of flinched from the Min-Koji standpoint, but those are discussions we need to have. So, as Representative Elkins pointed out, we've had a Data Practices Act actually since 1974. It began as a species of Data Privacy Act, and as a matter of fact, it was the first Data Privacy Act in the country, okay? It focused heavily on regulating the relationship between the government and those people on whom the government collects and maintains information, okay? Early in legislative history, it received a real serious injection of what are called fair information practice principles. Those principles came out of a study at the federal level. Essentially, Senator Bob Tennyson brought that stuff into the legislative process. And to this day, the fair information practice principles are embedded essentially in all data privacy legislation. They still are, okay? Most people don't seem to remember how old they are because they were first reported in 1973, okay? I almost brought my copy of the report and I couldn't find it in my stuff. Not long after we started talking about data privacy, the media became very interested in the fact that we had an ancient public records law. It didn't afford much public access to government information. And they became very strong advocates for either writing a new law or modifying the Data Privacy Act to cover freedom of information principles, okay? And they basically worked hard on that for about 4 years. And then in 1979, the Data Practices Act changed its kind of global identity and became a statute that not only dealt with data privacy, but also tried to guarantee maximum public access to government information. One thing that's important, I think, to know is that in this process, the people who worked at a detail level tended to be people who had information management backgrounds, okay? My boss, a little bit of me, a real serious information management guy from the Star Tribune. So always embedded in the Data Practices Act starting in '79 was a real strong emphasis on looking to the future and realizing that not everything was going to be on paper. And so if you look, for example, at the definition of government data, which is what the Data Practices Act regulates, you'll see it's a very, very broad definition. And it essentially encompasses any kind of form in which information can be collected and maintained, okay? That definition has stood fairly well for a long time. It's now starting to have real challenges, okay? Because frankly, texting didn't exist, Facebook didn't exist. All the ways government, most people and the government do business these days are now kind of we're behind that curve, as it were. One of the objectives in the Minnesota Coalition of Government Information is to spend some time working with the legislature on that. Let me give you an example. It's been in the news for the last couple of days. Axios, which is an online news reporting organization, noticed that when the governor was talking about the budget negotiations at the end of the session, he said something like, his phone was full of text messages, okay? So somebody at Axios said, there's got to be really good stuff in those text messages. They went to the governor's office, they asked for the text messages, and the response was, there aren't any, okay? As I said to somebody who asked me about it, that doesn't surprise me. I've been around too long, okay? But that's an illustration, I think, of one of the issues. And I want to make sure you understand, I don't do that kind of politics, okay? I'm not picking on the governor. This is a universal problem across the board. I see it a lot of different places, okay? So many times I deal with citizens who are trying to get access to government information. They're told it doesn't exist, and yet they have, from other sources, the exact copies of the information they're asking for from a government agency, so they know it exists, okay? That's one of the future problems. Now, in the Data Privacy Act and in the larger universe, what I'm seeing more than anything else is a vast amount of complexity, okay? I spent some time last night looking at the section of Minnesota statutes that creates you. That was interesting. Then I looked at the part of the Data Privacy Act that deals with data breaches. Then I looked at the part of not an entirely separate statute that deals with breaches of computer warehouses, which I think Representative Elkins can kind of grin, because how long, we haven't called them warehouses for years, okay? But that's what the statute calls them. Now we call them the cloud, okay? So the environment is really complex, okay? And one of the functions of complexity is when you start really going in and trying to talk at a detail level, people begin to glaze over, okay? Every once in a while, I think about Justice Alito of the United States Supreme Court. Right man, you know, he's a justice, he has one of the most powerful roles on the face of the earth. In a case about 5 years ago that involved computer technology, or surveillance technology, he basically said in his opinion, and I'm paraphrasing him, I think sometimes we're too dumb to be able to write law about this. And I thought, my God, if this is the United States Supreme Court, where are we? So we have lots of problems with complexity. And with the Data Privacy Act, as Representative Elkins mentioned, we have a law. There it is. It's 135, it's actually up to 142 the last time I counted, okay? I won't go into the reasons for that. The primary reason is the legislature wanted to exercise pretty maximum control over these issues, and there's only one way you do that, you pass laws, okay? So one of the ongoing discussions is whether or not we could find some way to reduce this, and I think one of the things that Representative Elkins suggested, I go through here and I find duplicative language that could be fixed, okay? Now, in terms of what I think you primarily asked me to talk about today is what changes can we make to the Data Privacy Act for it to be a more effective way to attain its objectives, which I think are still the same as they were at the beginning. If you go through the statute, and if need be, I can give you the detail, the major problem that emerged early on is how do you get the government to do what you tell it to do, okay? That is simply a matter of enforcement, okay? We had a strange fight with the city of St. Paul early on in the history of the Data Privacy Act, in which they said they didn't have to comply with the Data Privacy Act until the Department of Administration, which had been given the authority to issue rules, issued those rules. And it was like, what are you talking about? The law is the law. You know, we have to go through a rule-making process, which took us like 3 years, which is, we did it. But that was their position. They took it to court and they lost, okay? So the enforcement issue has always been in the Data Privacy Act. I can point you to 4 or 5 different attempts by the legislature to fix the enforcement problem, okay? For example, the base law says essentially you enforce the Data Privacy Act by suing a government agency for damages, okay? Problem number one, how do you prove damages with these kinds of issues, okay? Connected to that is the fact that much of what you've done in the Data Practices Act is related to regulating government processes and how the government relates to its citizens, okay? And the Data Practices Act has a lot of requirements that the government do things, establish procedures, that kind of thing. But again, how do you sue an agency if it hasn't established procedures? Give you an example, and I'll return to the university in a minute. For years, I have wondered as I see data breaches by government agencies, okay? And there are a lot of them, as you know. I keep wondering why nobody uses the Data Practices Act provisions that say to those agencies, you have to establish policies and procedures to protect the privacy and confidentiality of personal data. Why agencies aren't getting sued because they don't have those policies and procedures, okay? And in many cases that I've seen, we're talking about no procedures at all, okay? We're not talking about a good faith attempt to do something. We're talking about none whatsoever, okay? Keep in mind, the Data Practices Act not only regulates large state agencies, it also regulates small cities, okay? So there is a resource issue, okay? I think there are ways to deal with that, but there is a resource issue. So in the case of the university, when I first heard about this, I thought, oh God, I have so much history with the University of Minnesota. Number one, I'm not a graduate, understand that. I have nothing personal about the U, except I used to guest lecture at the U. And one day a student in one of the classes I lectured to came up to me and he said, you know, if I heard you right, you said it's not legal for the government to require me to give my Social Security number to the government. And I said, well, there's some exceptions to that, but generally that's the truth, that's the case. And he said, well, then how can the university make me give my Social Security number to register? I said, because it's simple, they're in violation of federal and state law, okay? And he said, well, what do I do about it? I said, you sue them. He said, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna sue the university. And he patted me on the back and walked away. And you know, after that, I ended up having several long discussions with the university about the fact they were doing that and it was not legal, okay? And their response, and it didn't surprise me, and again, because I'd worked in IT, we've built all kinds of systems around this number. If we go back and try and get rid of the number, then we're going to incur large cost, okay? In the process of that discussion, I learned MN.IT was doing the same thing. And I remember meeting with the head of IT from MN.IT, and he did not like what I had to say. He got really upset with me. So part of the reason for that is the law that regulates the collection of the Social Security number is, in my world, too obscure, okay? It's in Section 7 of the Federal Privacy Act of 1974. And when the feds passed that law, they did not include Section 7 as part of the federal statute called the Federal Privacy Act. And only because I was working in the stuff at the time did I learn about it, okay? And so after that, I would put that into my presentations. And subsequently, the Minnesota legislature, in looking at Social Security numbers, said that any place the government tries to collect a Social Security number, it has to treat that number as private, okay? Under the Data Practices Act, that means when somebody asks for that number, they have to receive the notice that's in the Data Practices Act that's popularly known as the Tennyson Warning, named after Bob Tennyson, okay? If you want to look at the statute, it's Section 1304, Subdivision 2, okay? It's the intent of that language is to give citizens the ability to protect themselves from privacy invasions by the government, okay? So for example, if the government wants my social security number, they have to tell me whether or not I have to provide it legally.
Right.
Okay. Number two, they have to tell me if I have to provide it, what they're going to do with it. Number three, they have to tell me who else is going to get it. Okay. And if I really feel strongly about my privacy and want to say to the government, you ain't getting it from me, I have that right. I'll suffer the consequence. So that's one illustration of how this works at a detail level that makes things very difficult, okay? And it's tied to enforcement. In the last 3 months, I've filled out 4 different state agency forms in various realities. None of them had a Tennyson warning on them. They all wanted private data from me, okay? Am I going to sue the Department of Revenue? I don't think so, okay? So, now, what can you do about it?
Yeah. Mr. Gimbling, I just want to alert you that we are kind of running a little short on time. We're at 11:28.
Oh,
And
I'm
so-
moving right along?
So,
Okay.
Yes.
What can you do about it?
yes, and I think it's important to talk about what we can do about it, and also thoughts you might have on ways in which the legislature might be looking at the future of the Data Practices Act and improvements that we might want to consider.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
3 things come to mind. Number one, the legislature used to have data privacy subcommittees, okay? That was abandoned some time ago. I encourage you to return to having those committees. You have a data practices commission, okay? It's a joint legislative commission. From my perspective, what they've done recently is they look at bills, and what they should be looking for is what they should be looking at is the big picture, the kind of things we're talking about, okay? Number 2, and this is almost like a personal plea, one of the things lacking now, and Richard Neumeister and I talk about this all the time, is there are no longer serious champions for these issues in the legislature, okay? One of the joys is I used to work with people like Gene Merriam, Randy Peterson, Liz Holberg. They were people who, for whatever reasons, really cared about this stuff. And so, you felt like investing in them, helping them, tutoring them, do whatever you could to help them, okay? Now, Representative Elkins has taken on some of that role, but he's also taken that to a different dimension, which is important and somebody needed to do. So, but in terms of the government focus, the champions aren't there anymore. And so that's important. Number 3, you can look seriously at the issue of enforcement, okay? There have been 3 or 4 different commissions that have studied how to make the Data Practices Act better. And one of their recommendations from each and every one of them, and they had different membership over different time, was essentially you cannot have a system that relies solely on people getting sued, okay? You have to establish a regime similar to what they do in Europe and in Canada of an agency that works with agencies and with the public to make sure that whatever you decide is going to be, the legislation is actually enforced, okay? When I was working, I got to know how other people do this, and I know how much better it is, okay? And I also realized there are political problems with that. Mary Liz Holberg and I used to have really good discussions about the fact that you want me to create more government, and I understand, but I can't frankly give you a more effective idea based on what I know, okay? So, I'm done. I'm quite happy to answer any questions. I'm quite happy to come back.
Okay.
And I appreciate your intention, so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Mr. Gimberling. We appreciate it. I do want to, I know we are at 11:30, but do we have any members with questions for Mr. Gimberling as it stands? No? Any on the Zoom? No. Okay. Well, we do not actually have any questions, but I think it might be worth us exploring, looking up some of the recommendations from those previous task force on how to make it better, and certainly using that as a basis for some of our further study here on the commission. And with that, I also do know, and I know we're tight on time, but I do have one member of the public who would like to potentially make some comments. Do we have any? Okay, we're going to give just a minute or two for a member of the public to weigh in on this particular topic. We do not normally do that when we don't have a bill before us, but we do also like to encourage transparency and encourage the public to take part.
Madam
All right,
Chair.
thank you. Mr.
Madam Chair,
Neumeister.
members of the commission, my name is Rich Neumeister. Thank you for the opportunity. I very much encourage you in the future to include a broad array of parties if you're with significant changes to a law, that there's all kinds of interest. For me, over the years, I've dealt with privacy and right to know. So it is a dynamic. It's one that takes a lot of hard work and a lot of due diligence. And I agree in general, there needs to be a review. I sat on one of those commission 20 years ago. And Madam Chair, I just want to say thank you for your work and the committees, and hopefully it's just important for all of us to be all involved.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neumeister. I appreciate that. And, you know, I think I just want to clarify for the general public today's conversation. You know, one of the things, as I mentioned at the top of the discussion, is that there's a renewed effort to talk about the privacy of people's, or the sensitivity of private and sensitive data, how we collect it, how we store it, what impact that has on if there's a cybersecurity incident. And of course, we know data is the #1 target generally behind those attacks. And so we do have to be thoughtful about how government handles that data as well. And I think we have a responsibility to the general public to have conversations about what we're collecting and how we're collecting it, how we're storing it, and for how long, and really our responsibilities as well as government agencies. In many cases, folks do not have a choice in providing that information to us as a matter of delivering basic core services. So I think it is important for us to also be good stewards of those topics. So I'm certain that this conversation will continue into the future, but certainly I'm grateful for the participation today to open that conversation, and I'm sure we will continue it as well. With that, we are a little bit over time. My apologies on that. But with that, we are going to call this session to a close.